May 27, 1940. The air hung thick with salt and diesel as Sergeant Roland Hawthorne crouched inside the cramped radio hut near the eastern mole at Dunkirk. His fingers trembled, not from fear, but from 72 hours without proper sleep. Around him, the chaos of evacuation operations had reached fever pitch. 300,000 Allied soldiers were trapped on these beaches, with the German army closing in from all sides. Through the small window, Hawthorne could see the long lines of men standing in water up to their shoulders, waiting for rescue boats that seemed impossibly distant. The radio crackled with distress calls and coordinates, each transmission more desperate than the last. A Luftwaffe bombing run had just ended, leaving the harbour waters slick with oil and worse. Hawthorne wiped sweat from his brow, leaving a streak of grime across his forehead. The distinctive drone of aircraft engines grew louder again. The scouts were returning, marking targets for the next wave of bombers. "Command says maintain radio silence except for evacuation coordination," barked Captain Westfield, ducking his head into the radio shack. "Absolute priority on ship-to-shore communications only." Hawthorne nodded, but his eyes never left the jury-rigged frequency scanner he'd assembled from spare parts. It wasn't standard issue. In fact, it violated every protocol in the communications handbook. For 3 days, he'd been quietly mapping the Luftwaffe frequency patterns, noting how their scouts communicated positions back to the bomber groups. The captain left, and Hawthorne made a decision. His hand moved to a switch that would broadcast on a frequency he had no authorization to use. The radio equipment whined as he turned dials to settings no British radio operator had been trained to employ. No one in the Royal Signal Corps knew that one man's technical defiance that morning would rewrite the history of the Dunkirk evacuation, saving thousands of lives in the next 12 hours through nothing more than radio waves and mathematical intuition. Roland Hawthorne hadn't always been a soldier. Born in 1914 in the small coastal town of Whitby, Yorkshire, he was the son of a lighthouse keeper and a schoolteacher. The rhythmic patterns of light signals and the mathematical precision required to maintain the lighthouse became second nature to him from an early age. His mother, noticing his aptitude for numbers, encouraged his education despite their limited means. By 16, young Roland had built his first crystal radio set from discarded parts and a manual he'd saved for months to purchase. While other boys his age played football or dreamed of working on fishing trawlers, Roland spent hours tuning into distant broadcasts, mapping the invisible landscape of radio waves. He kept detailed notebooks of frequencies, signal strengths, and atmospheric conditions. "The boy lives with his head in the clouds," his father would say not unkindly, always listening for voices most people can't hear. In 1936, Hawthorne graduated from the University of Leeds with a degree in electrical engineering, one of only 3 students from his town to attend university that decade. His professors noted his unusual ability to conceptualize radio wave propagation and his talent for improvising equipment from minimal parts. Yet, despite his intelligence, Hawthorne struggled in formal settings, often challenging established methods when he saw more efficient solutions. "Brilliant but stubborn," his final assessment read, "requires supervision to follow standard procedures." When war seemed increasingly inevitable in 1938, Hawthorne volunteered for the Royal Corps of Signals rather than waiting for conscription. His technical background made him a natural candidate, though his training officers quickly noted his tendency to modify equipment without authorization. "Hawthorne shows exceptional aptitude," wrote his training sergeant, "but demonstrates concerning disregard for established protocols. Recommend close supervision in field operations." Despite these concerns, the desperate need for skilled radio operators saw Hawthorne deployed to France with the British Expeditionary Force in early 1940. His unit was attached to the 3rd Infantry Division, responsible for maintaining communications along a 20-mile section of the Allied front. His comrades initially viewed him with suspicion. Hawthorne spoke little of his background and spent his free time disassembling and reassembling radio equipment, often adding modifications that weren't in any technical manual. Private Jenkins, who shared a tent with Hawthorne, once found him asleep with a technical diagram clutched in his hands, mathematical formulas scribbled in the margins. "The man's a bloody genius or completely mad," Jenkins told the others. "Maybe both." Yet Hawthorne's modifications often improved range and clarity, earning grudging respect from his unit. When standard equipment failed during an artillery barrage in April, Hawthorne's jury-rigged transmitter maintained contact with headquarters when other units went silent. He had no idea that soon those improvisations would be all that stood between the entire British Expeditionary Force and complete destruction. The Battle of France had begun on May 10, 1940, with the German blitzkrieg smashing through the Ardennes and bypassing the Maginot Line. The speed and ferocity of the German advance caught the Allies completely unprepared. Within 2 weeks, German armoured divisions had reached the English Channel, cutting off the British Expeditionary Force and the best units of the French army from the rest of France. By May 24th, the situation had become desperate. 330,000 Allied troops were being pushed steadily toward the Channel coast with their backs to the sea. The only viable evacuation point was Dunkirk, a small port never designed to accommodate such numbers. The British War Cabinet authorized Operation Dynamo, the emergency evacuation of as many troops as possible, before they were captured or destroyed by advancing German forces. The Royal Navy estimated they might save perhaps 30,000 men at best. The rest would be lost, killed or captured in what threatened to become the greatest military disaster in British history. The German High Command recognized the vulnerable position of the trapped Allied forces. Luftwaffe squadrons were dispatched to pound the beaches and harbour at Dunkirk, targeting the makeshift evacuation fleet of warships and civilian vessels that had been hastily assembled. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt had even ordered a halt to the German ground advance on May 24th, preferring to let the Luftwaffe destroy the cornered British and French troops rather than risk his tanks in the marshy terrain around Dunkirk. What few people realized at the time was how crucial air superiority would be to the evacuation's success or failure. The Royal Air Force was fighting desperately to protect the beaches, but they were outnumbered and operating at the extreme edge of their range from bases in southern England. The Luftwaffe's tactical approach relied heavily on scout aircraft, primarily Messerschmitt 110 fighters and Dornier 17 light bombers, that would locate troop concentrations and ship positions, then relay this information to the main bomber forces. These scout planes used a sophisticated radio coordination system that allowed them to direct bombing runs with devastating precision. Each morning and afternoon, formations of 20 to 30 scout aircraft would appear over Dunkirk, flying in precise patterns as they mapped Allied positions for the bombers that would follow. Radio silence was maintained except for brief, encoded transmissions sent on frequencies that changed according to a predetermined pattern. The Royal Navy had lost 5 destroyers and numerous smaller vessels to these coordinated attacks by May 27th. Nearly 40,000 men had been evacuated, but over 290,000 remained trapped on the beaches and in the surrounding countryside. Sergeant Hawthorne's 3rd Infantry Division had retreated to defensive positions just east of Dunkirk 2 days earlier. As communication systems broke down amid the chaos, Hawthorne and 3 other radio operators were reassigned directly to the evacuation headquarters at the Eastern Mole, the long concrete jetty that became the primary evacuation point for troops boarding ships. They were given clear orders: maintain communication channels between the beaches and the approaching ships, coordinate loading operations, and report enemy air activity. Under no circumstances were they to attempt to intercept or interfere with enemy communications, as such actions required specialized equipment and training that they did not possess. But Sergeant Roland Hawthorne had other ideas, and the seeds of his defiance were about to change the course of the entire operation. The radio hut where Hawthorne worked was little more than a wooden shed perched at the landward end of the Eastern Mole. From this position, he could see the endless lines of exhausted soldiers stretching back into the town and along the beaches. Every few hours, Luftwaffe bombers would appear, dropping their payloads with terrible precision on the mole and the ships approaching it. "They always know exactly where to hit us," muttered Corporal Wallace, who manned the adjacent radio set. "It's like they can see through the clouds." Hawthorne said nothing, but his mind was already working on the problem. During the quiet pre-dawn hours of May 26th, he had detected a pattern in the German radio traffic, brief bursts of transmission, seemingly random but occurring at 20-minute intervals. By the morning of May 27th, He had filled an entire notebook with frequency numbers, times, and signal strengths. "What's all this, then?" asked Lieutenant Morris, the communications officer, catching sight of Hawthorne's notes. "Just keeping track of atmospherics, sir," Hawthorne replied. "Helps me adjust for better reception." Morris nodded, though his expression showed doubt. "Carry on, but remember, evacuation communications only. That's your priority." "Yes, sir," Hawthorne replied, but as soon as the officer left, he returned to his calculations. By midday, he had identified what he believed was the Luftwaffe's Scout aircraft coordination system. Unlike British protocols, which used fixed frequencies changed only at specific times of day, the German system employed a mathematical progression. Each transmission shifted frequency according to a formula. It was elegant and nearly impossible to track without knowing the underlying pattern. Nearly impossible, unless you happened to be Roland Hawthorne, who had spent his youth tracking lighthouse signals and mapping radio wave patterns. "Sir," he said, approaching Lieutenant Morris during a rare lull in the bombing. "I believe I found something important about the German air operations." Morris looked up from his maps, dark circles under his eyes betraying his exhaustion. "What is it, Sergeant?" "The scout planes, sir. They're using a progressive frequency pattern to coordinate with the bombers. If we could disrupt it—" "Absolutely not," Morris cut him off. "We have no equipment or authorization for counter-signal operations. That's a job for specialized units back in England." He lowered his voice. "Besides, any attempt to broadcast on enemy frequencies could give away our position. We'd be targeted immediately." "But, sir—" "That's enough, Sergeant. Return to your post and focus on evacuation communications. That's an order." Hawthorne saluted stiffly and returned to his radio set. Through the window, he could see another ship being hit, black smoke billowing as men jumped into the water. The next scheduled German scout formation would arrive in approximately 2 hours, based on the pattern he'd observed. 2 hours to decide whether to follow orders or attempt something that could get him court-martialed, or worse, get everyone killed if he was wrong. The afternoon of May 27th brought temporary cloud cover, providing brief respite from the constant Luftwaffe attacks. Hawthorne used this time to make final modifications to his radio set, carefully connecting components he'd salvaged from damaged equipment. His hands moved with practiced precision despite his exhaustion. Corporal Wallace watched with growing concern. "What are you doing to that set? The lieutenant will have your stripes if you damage it." "Just a temporary modification," Hawthorne replied without looking up. "I'll return it to standard configuration before anyone notices." Wallace shook his head. "Your funeral, mate." He glanced at his watch. "I'm due for a break. Try not to blow us all up while I'm gone." As soon as Wallace left, Hawthorne connected the final wires to the amplifier he'd constructed. The makeshift device hummed with electricity, drawing more power than regulation equipment was supposed to use. He checked his notebook one last time, confirming the frequency progression he'd calculated. According to his observations, the next Luftwaffe scout formation should arrive at approximately 1600 hours and would begin transmitting position coordinates back to their base at 1615. If his calculations were correct, they would use a sequence of 5 frequencies over a 30-minute period. Hawthorne tuned his modified set to the first projected frequency and waited. Outside, the sounds of evacuation continued. Boat engines, shouted orders, the distant rumble of artillery. At precisely 15:55, the drone of aircraft engines became audible. The scouts had arrived. Through the small window, Hawthorne caught glimpses of the distinctive silhouettes of Messerschmitt, 110 fighters circling high above the beaches. His palms began to sweat as he counted them. Exactly 20 aircraft, flying in a precise search pattern. At 16:14, his radio crackled with a burst of German transmission, exactly on the frequency he had predicted. Hawthorne quickly adjusted his dials, recording the brief code sequence. The transmission ended, and he immediately switched to the next frequency in his calculated progression. Right on schedule, another transmission began exactly 4 minutes later. His calculations had been correct. Now came the moment of decision. Hawthorne's plan was both simple and audacious. Instead of trying to jam the German transmissions, which would require power he didn't have, He would transmit false information on the same frequencies, mimicking the format of the authentic reports, but providing coordinates several miles away from the actual evacuation beaches. If it worked, the following bomber formations would target empty coastline. If it failed, he would give away his position and potentially draw fire directly to the command post and the most critical evacuation point. Hawthorne took a deep breath and pressed the transmit button. Speaking in careful German, another skill he'd never reported to his superiors, he sent a brief message matching the format he'd observed, but altering the coordinates. Then he quickly switched to the next frequency and repeated the process. For 25 minutes he maintained this deception, heart pounding with each transmission. Through the window, he could see the scout planes continuing their pattern, apparently unaware that their communications were being intercepted and mimicked. At 1640, the scout formation turned and headed back toward France. Hawthorne slumped in his chair, sweat soaking his uniform despite the cool air. Now he could only wait to see if his gamble had worked. Lieutenant Morris returned to the radio hut at 1700 hours. "Scout report?" he asked briskly. "Formation of 20 aircraft observed from 1555 to 1640, sir," Hawthorne reported formally. "No changes to standard patrol pattern noted." Morris nodded. "The next bomber wave should be here any minute. Make sure all ships in the harbor are warned." Hawthorne complied, sending the standard alert to the vessels currently loading troops. Then he watched the sky and waited. At 1715, the familiar drone of heavy bombers approached from the southeast. Hawthorne held his breath as the formation of 30 Heinkel 111 bombers appeared through the clouds. But instead of turning toward the harbor and beaches, they continued northward, eventually releasing their bombs on an empty stretch of coastline nearly 5 miles away. Lieutenant Morris stared in disbelief. "They missed completely. How is that possible?" "Perhaps the cloud cover confused them, sir," Hawthorne suggested, fighting to keep his expression neutral. "Well, whatever the reason, it's a bloody miracle," Morris replied. "That's the first bomber group that's missed the target all week." Hawthorne said nothing, but inside he felt a surge of fierce satisfaction. His theory had worked, but one successful deception didn't prove the method. The real test would come with the evening raids, which were typically the heaviest of the day. As the afternoon wore on, Hawthorne continued his official duties, coordinating ship arrivals and departures. Nearly 8,000 men were evacuated during those uninterrupted hours. Men who would likely have died had the bombing continued at its previous intensity. At 1830, another scout formation appeared overhead. Hawthorne waited until Corporal Wallace went to deliver a message to the beachmaster, then quickly reconnected his modified equipment. Once again, he intercepted the German transmissions and broadcast his false coordinates. And once again, when the bomber formation arrived at 1915, they struck empty beaches miles from the actual evacuation point. Captain Westfield, who had taken over command of the communications post for the night shift, was baffled. "2 bombing runs completely off target," he said to no one in particular. "Either Jerry's navigation has gone to hell, or something's interfering with their coordination." Hawthorne kept his eyes fixed on his radio dials. "Very fortunate for us, sir." "Indeed," Westfield agreed. "If this keeps up, we might actually get these boys home." Throughout the night of May 27th and into the morning of May 28th, Hawthorne maintained his deception whenever German scout planes appeared. He worked in brief windows when his fellow operators were occupied elsewhere, always returning his equipment to standard configuration before anyone could notice. The results were dramatic. Of 8 bomber formations dispatched against Dunkirk during that period, 6 missed their targets entirely. The 2 that did strike the evacuation beaches did so with noticeably less precision than before. By dawn on May 28th, the rate of evacuation had more than doubled. Ships approached and departed without the constant threat of air attack, and the troops waiting on the beaches began to believe they might actually survive. Warrant Officer Jenkins entered the radio hut just before sunrise, carrying a message from the beach commander. "Something very strange is happening," he told the communications team. "The Germans seem to have lost their ability to target us accurately. Command wants to know if anyone has any explanation." All eyes turned to Lieutenant Morris, who shook his head. "No idea. Perhaps their equipment is malfunctioning, or our RAF boys are disrupting their formations more than we realize." Hawthorne kept his face carefully blank, focusing on the routine weather report he was transcribing. But inside, a storm of conflicting emotions raged. Pride in his successful deception battled with fear of discovery and court-martial. What he was doing violated every protocol in the book: unauthorized use of equipment, broadcasting on enemy frequencies, impersonating enemy communications. If discovered, he would likely face charges of insubordination at minimum, possibly even treason if his actions were misinterpreted. Yet with each ship that safely departed the harbor, hundreds more soldiers would live to fight another day. At 0800 hours, Lieutenant Morris was summoned to a command meeting, leaving Hawthorne temporarily in charge of the radio post. As soon as the opportunity presented itself, he carefully removed his modifications from the equipment and hid them beneath the floorboards of the radio hut. His gamble had worked beyond all expectations, but he knew he couldn't maintain the deception indefinitely. Sooner or later, the Germans would realize something was wrong and change their communication methods. For now, though, the phantom frequencies he'd created had bought precious time for Operation Dynamo, and time was the one resource the trapped Allied forces needed most desperately. The hours of May 28th blurred into an exhausted haze for Sergeant Roland Hawthorne. He maintained his regular duties coordinating evacuation communications while continuing his unauthorized frequency deception whenever possible. The strain of maintaining both roles, official radio operator and clandestine electronic warfare specialist, took its toll. By midday, his hands trembled constantly, and he had to concentrate fiercely to avoid making errors in routine transmissions. "You look terrible," Corporal Wallace told him during a brief lull. "When did you last sleep?" "Can't remember," Hawthorne admitted. "Tuesday, maybe. You should get some rest. I can handle things here for a few hours." Hawthorne shook his head. "Can't spare anyone right now, too much traffic." The truth was, he couldn't risk someone else operating his equipment and discovering the modifications he'd made. Despite his exhaustion, he needed to remain at his post. At 1400 hours, reports came in of a large Luftwaffe formation approaching from the southeast, much larger than the previous scout groups. Lieutenant Morris, who had returned from his meeting looking grave, ordered all ship movements temporarily halted. "Intelligence says this is a major strike force," he informed the communications team. "At least 60 aircraft, possibly more. They're throwing everything they have at us." Hawthorne felt a chill of dread. His deception had worked against the scout planes and smaller bomber groups, but a formation this size would likely have its own forward observers and communication systems. There was little chance his phantom frequencies would divert such a concentrated attack. Yet he had to try. As the drone of dozens of aircraft engines grew louder, Hawthorne quickly reconnected his modified equipment and began broadcasting on what he believed would be the primary coordination frequency. Speaking rapid German, he transmitted false coordinates and weather conditions, claiming heavy cloud cover over the actual evacuation beaches. Through the window, he could see the massive formation appearing on the horizon: Heinkel 111s, Dornier 17s, and Junkers 87s escorted by Messerschmitt 109 fighters. The sky seemed to fill with aircraft, their black crosses clearly visible against the afternoon sun. Lieutenant Morris stood at the window, binoculars raised. "My God," he whispered, "there must be 70 or 80 of them." Hawthorne continued his transmission, keeping his voice steady despite the terror building inside him. This would be the test of his theory, and possibly the last minutes of his life if he failed. The formation approached to within 5 miles of Dunkirk. Then something extraordinary happened. Instead of proceeding directly to the harbor and beaches, the aircraft began to separate into smaller groups, turning toward different sections of coastline. Some headed north, others east, still others west, but remarkably few continued toward the main evacuation points. "They're splitting up," Morris said in disbelief, "breaking formation completely." Hawthorne watched in amazement as the Luftwaffe's coordinated attack disintegrated into scattered bombing runs across miles of empty coastline. Of the estimated 70 aircraft, fewer than 15 approached close enough to threaten the actual evacuation operations. "It's as if they don't know where we are," Wallace said, incredulous. "How is that possible? We have thousands of men standing on open beaches." Lieutenant Morris lowered his binoculars, his expression a mixture of confusion and relief. "I don't understand it either, but I'm not complaining. Get on the radio and tell those ships to resume loading operations immediately. We need to take advantage of every minute of this, whatever it is." As Wallace hurried to comply, Morris turned to Hawthorne. "Any ideas, Sergeant? This doesn't make sense tactically." Hawthorne chose his words carefully. "Perhaps there's confusion in their command structure, sir. Or they're attempting to hit multiple targets simultaneously to prevent us from concentrating our defenses." Morris frowned, clearly unsatisfied with this explanation, but unable to offer a better one. "Well, whatever the reason, it's working in our favor. Let's hope their navigational problems continue." For the remainder of that day and through the night, Hawthorne maintained his deception whenever German aircraft appeared. The pattern became clear. Scout planes would arrive, conduct their observation flights, and transmit coordinates. Hawthorne would intercept these transmissions and broadcast false information on the same frequencies. When the bomber formations arrived, they would scatter across miles of coastline, largely missing the critical evacuation points. By dawn on May 29th, the rate of evacuation had increased dramatically. Nearly 47,000 men had been rescued in the previous 24 hours alone, far more than the most optimistic projections had suggested possible. But Hawthorne's success came with increasing physical and mental costs. He had now been awake for nearly 72 hours straight, sustaining himself with weak tea and army biscuits. His vision occasionally blurred, and he found himself making simple mathematical errors that he would never have made when fresh. Worse, he suspected that the Germans were beginning to realize something was wrong with their communication system. The scout planes had altered their flight patterns, becoming less predictable in their movements and transmission times. Hawthorne had to work increasingly hard to anticipate the frequencies they would use and time his counterfeit broadcasts precisely. Late in the afternoon of May 29th, a new threat appeared. A single Junkers 88 aircraft approached from an unusual direction, flying much lower than the typical scout planes. Instead of the standard search pattern, it flew directly over the harbor area, then immediately turned and departed without any radio transmission. "That's not normal behavior," Lieutenant Morris noted with concern. What was he doing? Hawthorne had a sinking feeling he knew exactly what the aircraft was doing. "Visual confirmation, sir. I think they may suspect their radio communications are being compromised." Morris shot him a sharp look. "Why would they think that? Our signal intelligence units don't have the capability to intercept their tactical communications." "Just speculation, sir," Hawthorne replied, avoiding the lieutenant's gaze. But that aircraft was clearly gathering visual intelligence rather than relying on radio reports. His suspicion proved correct. Less than an hour later, a formation of 20 Stuka dive bombers approached from the east, maintaining complete radio silence. Without radio coordination to disrupt, Hawthorne could only watch helplessly as they executed a devastating attack on ships in the harbor. 2 destroyers and several smaller vessels were hit, with significant casualties. Lieutenant Morris cursed as he watched black smoke billow from the burning ships. "They've changed tactics. No advance warning, no coordination transmissions we can detect." Hawthorne nodded grimly. "They may continue with these silent attacks, sir. Then we'll have to rely more heavily on our fighter cover from England," Morris said. "I'll inform command that the Germans appear to be shifting to visual targeting rather than radio-coordinated attacks." As Morris left to deliver this information, Hawthorne sat heavily in his chair, the weight of his actions settling on him. His unauthorized electronic deception had brought nearly 2 days of reduced German effectiveness, allowing thousands of men to escape who would otherwise have died. But now the enemy had adapted, and the respite was ending. What he didn't know was that the German adaptation had come too late. His phantom frequencies had already altered the course of the Dunkirk evacuation in ways that would reverberate through the entire war. The final days of Operation Dynamo, May 30th through June 4th, saw renewed Luftwaffe efforts to destroy the evacuation fleet. Yet despite increasing attacks, the miracle of Dunkirk continued. Ships large and small crossed the channel repeatedly, braving bombs, torpedoes and mines to rescue the trapped Allied soldiers. Sergeant Roland Hawthorne remained at his post in the radio hut, continuing his official duties while looking for opportunities to resume his frequency deception when possible. As the Germans altered their communication methods, his effectiveness diminished, but he still managed to disrupt several bombing raids through carefully timed false transmissions. By June 1st, the majority of British forces had been evacuated, leaving primarily French troops on the beaches. Hawthorne's unit received orders to depart on one of the last Royal Navy destroyers, scheduled to leave before the final French rearguard action. As he packed his equipment, Lieutenant Morris approached him. "Sergeant, I've been reviewing the communication logs for the past week," he said, his tone carefully neutral. "I've noticed some discrepancies in the power usage records for your radio set." Hawthorne felt his heart rate increase. "Sir, on May 27th and 28th, your equipment drew nearly twice the normal power allocation, yet there's no record of additional authorized transmissions." Morris's eyes narrowed slightly. "Would you care to explain?" For a moment, Hawthorne considered lying, claiming equipment malfunction or record-keeping error. But exhaustion and the strain of his deception had worn away his capacity for further subterfuge. "I modified the equipment to broadcast on German coordination frequencies. Sir," he admitted quietly, "I identified their scout plane communication pattern and transmitted false coordinates to divert their bombing runs." Morris stared at him, shock evident in his expression. "You did what? Without authorization? That's a court-martial offense, Sergeant." "Yes, sir, I'm aware of that." "Do you have any idea the risk you took? If the Germans had traced those transmissions, you could have drawn direct fire on our primary evacuation point." "I calculated that risk, sir," Hawthorne replied steadily, "and weighed it against the certainty of continued precision bombing if I did nothing." Morris paced the small room, running a hand through his disheveled hair. "So all those bombing runs that missed their targets, that was your doing?" "I believe so, sir, yes, at least during the period of May 27th through 29th. "My God." Morris stopped pacing and looked at Hawthorne with an unreadable expression. "Do you realize what you've done?" "I disobeyed direct orders, sir. I'm prepared to face the consequences." "No, you fool," Morris said, his voice suddenly softer. "You saved thousands of lives, maybe tens of thousands." He shook his head slowly. "Official estimates are that we've evacuated over 330,000 men. The initial projection was 30,000 at most." Hawthorne remained silent, unsure how to respond. "I should report this," Morris continued. "By every regulation in the book, I should have you arrested immediately." "I understand, sir." Morris was quiet for a long moment, looking out the window at the continuing evacuation operations. Finally, he turned back to Hawthorne. "I'm going to forget we had this conversation, Sergeant. Your equipment malfunctioned due to battle damage drawing excess power. That's what my report will say." His expression hardened. "But this never happened. Do you understand me? Never. You will not speak of this to anyone, not your comrades, not your family, not even in your personal diaries. This conversation never took place." Hawthorne stared at him in confusion. "Sir, what you did was unauthorized electronic warfare, Sergeant. If word got out that a non-specialized radio operator could identify and exploit enemy communication patterns so effectively, it would compromise our own security protocols." Morris's voice was deadly serious. "This remains classified at the highest level, is that clear?" "Yes, sir, completely clear." "Good." Morris checked his watch. "Our transport leaves in 30 minutes. Complete your equipment check and report to the mole for embarkation." As Morris turned to leave, Hawthorne spoke up. "Sir, may I ask why? Why cover this up?" Morris paused at the door. "Because sometimes, Sergeant, the most effective weapons are the ones the enemy doesn't know exist." He gave Hawthorne a final appraising look. "When we get back to England, you'll be reassigned. I think signal intelligence will find your particular skills useful." With that, he was gone, leaving Hawthorne alone with his thoughts and the knowledge of what his phantom frequencies had accomplished. Sergeant Roland Hawthorne returned to England on June 1st, 1940, aboard HMS Winchelsea, one of the last Royal Navy vessels to leave Dunkirk before the final phase of the evacuation. Like most of the rescued soldiers, he was immediately given 7 days' leave to recover from the ordeal. Unlike most, however, he did not return to his home in Yorkshire. Instead, he received sealed orders directing him to report to a nondescript country house in Buckinghamshire, a location that officially did not exist on any military roster. There, he found himself in the company of mathematicians, linguists, and engineering specialists, all working on what was described only as special radio research. For the remainder of the war, Hawthorne's service record showed a series of mundane postings to signal units in non-combat zones. The reality was far different. Under the codename Phantom, he became part of a small elite team developing electronic countermeasures against German radio communications. His innovations, born from those desperate days at Dunkirk, evolved into sophisticated techniques that would be used throughout the European theater. The official history of the Dunkirk evacuation made no mention of disrupted Luftwaffe communications or inexplicably inaccurate bombing runs. The miracle was attributed to a combination of bad weather, Royal Air Force protection, and the indomitable spirit of the rescuers. In a sense, this was true. All these factors played their part. But the 2 critical days when German bombing accuracy mysteriously failed remained an unexplained footnote in most accounts. After the war, Hawthorne returned to civilian life with little fanfare. He married Elizabeth Carrington, their Women's Auxiliary Air Force officer. He had met during his specialized service in 1946. They settled in Cambridge, where Hawthorne took a position as a research technician at the university's physics department. Together, they raised 3 children, none of whom knew the full extent of their father's wartime activities. Hawthorne rarely spoke of his war experiences, describing his service only as routine communications work. When pressed, he would mention Dunkirk briefly, focusing on the courage of the sailors who crossed the Channel under fire rather than his own role. In 1963, Professor Stanley Morrison, a military historian researching the Dunkirk evacuation, noticed a curious pattern in Luftwaffe bombing effectiveness during the critical period of May 27 through 29, 1940. His review of after-action reports showed an unexplained 57% reduction in bombing accuracy compared to the days before and after. Morrison's inquiries to the Ministry of Defense met with polite but firm refusals to provide additional information. His subsequent book, The Miracle of Dunkirk, included only a brief reference to possible electronic countermeasures during this period with no supporting details. Unknown to Morrison, his inquiries had triggered a security review that reached Roland Hawthorne in his quiet academic life. A representative from the Ministry of Defense visited him at home, reminding him of his continuing obligation under the Official Secrets Act. Hawthorne assured the representative that he had maintained his silence for over 20 years and would continue to do so. That might have been the end of the story had it not been for a chance encounter in 1971. While attending a physics conference in London, Hawthorne found himself seated next to an elderly German gentleman at dinner. During their conversation, it emerged that the man, Dr. Wilhelm Krebs, had served as a communications officer with the Luftwaffe during the war. After several glasses of wine, their conversation turned to their respective wartime experiences. Krebs mentioned his frustration during the Dunkirk evacuation, when bomber units under his command repeatedly missed their targets due to what he called the phantom frequencies. For 2 critical days, Krebs said, shaking his head at the memory, our pilots reported receiving conflicting coordinates. Some followed one set of instructions, some another. Complete chaos. We lost nearly 20 scout aircraft trying to verify the correct positions. He sighed heavily. By the time we realized our communication channels had been compromised, the bulk of the British Army had escaped. Hawthorne listened in silence, his face carefully neutral despite the surge of emotion he felt. Here, after 31 years, was confirmation from the other side of what his unauthorized action had accomplished. We never did discover who was responsible, Krebs continued. Our high command assumed it was a sophisticated British electronic warfare unit. He chuckled ruefully. They increased security protocols for all our communications after that. One man's cleverness forced us to completely redesign our systems. Hawthorne merely nodded and steered the conversation to safer topics. He never revealed his identity to Krebs, but the encounter left him with a profound sense of validation. His phantom frequencies had indeed changed the course of events at Dunkirk, perhaps even the course of the war itself. In 1979, as part of the declassification of certain wartime operations, a heavily redacted report mentioned unorthodox electronic countermeasures deployed at Dunkirk by specialized personnel. Roland Hawthorne, by then retired and living quietly in Cornwall, received a letter from the Ministry of Defence informing him that while specific details of his actions remained classified, the general nature of the operation could now be acknowledged. With this limited release from secrecy, Hawthorne finally shared the story with his wife and children, though even then he downplayed his own role and emphasized the collective effort of the evacuation. Elizabeth, who had suspected much but asked little during their 33 years of marriage, listened to his account with tears in her eyes. When he finished, she took his hands in hers and said simply, "I always knew you were more than just a radio operator." Their eldest son, James, was incredulous. "You mean all those lives, thousands of them, were saved because you broke the rules?" Hawthorne shook his head. "Not because I broke the rules, son, because I understood the principles behind them well enough to know when they needed to be adapted." In 1983, Roland Hawthorne died peacefully at his home, aged 69. His obituary in the local paper described him only as a retired university technician and war veteran. A small military honor guard attended his funeral, the only official acknowledgement of his service beyond standard veterans recognition. 3 months after his death, Elizabeth received a visit from a senior officer in Royal Signals Intelligence. He presented her with a sealed envelope containing a handwritten note from the Prime Minister, thanking Roland Hawthorne for his extraordinary service to the nation during its darkest hour. Accompanying the note was a rarely awarded military decoration, the Intelligence Star, given posthumously for actions that remain classified to this day. The full details of Sergeant Roland Hawthorne's phantom frequencies at Dunkirk would not be declassified until 2005, 65 years after the events took place. By then, most of those directly involved had passed away, including Hawthorne himself. The technical report, when finally released, described his unauthorized electronic deception as a pivotal innovation in tactical electronic warfare that directly contributed to the successful evacuation of over 100,000 personnel who would otherwise have been lost. Military communications experts who studied the declassified material were astonished at what Hawthorne had accomplished with modified standard equipment and mathematical insight. Professor Catherine Lansing of the Royal Military College of Science noted in her analysis, "What Sergeant Hawthorne achieved with improvised equipment and intuitive understanding of radio wave propagation would later require teams of specialists and purpose-built systems. His actions at Dunkirk represent one of the earliest and most effective examples of tactical electronic warfare by a single operator. Perhaps the most poignant testimony came from former Private Edward Jenkins, one of the last surviving members of Hawthorne's original signal unit, interviewed for a documentary in 2007 at the age of 87. "We all knew Hawthorne was different," Jenkins recalled. "Always tinkering with the equipment, making modifications, the officers pretended not to notice because they worked better than standard issue. But none of us had any idea what he did at Dunkirk. To think that one man with a jury-rigged radio set could save so many." His voice trailed off, then strengthened again. But that was Hawthorne, quiet, unassuming, but with a mind like no one else I ever met. The type who could see patterns where the rest of us just heard noise. The story of Roland Hawthorne and his phantom frequencies offers a powerful lesson about innovation, courage, and the occasional necessity of disobedience in warfare. In the rigid hierarchy of military command, there are rare moments when an individual's specialized knowledge and moral clarity must override established protocols. Hawthorne's decision to violate direct orders was not made lightly, nor was it born from disrespect for authority. Rather, it came from the deep understanding that rules are designed for typical situations, and Dunkirk was anything but typical. In that desperate moment, with hundreds of thousands of lives hanging in the balance, He recognized that his unique skills offered a solution no one else had seen. What makes Hawthorne's story particularly remarkable is not just that he broke the rules, but how he broke them. He didn't abandon his duties or create chaos. Instead, he augmented his assigned role with additional actions that he alone was qualified to perform. He understood both the technical aspects of radio wave propagation and the psychological patterns of German communications procedures well enough to exploit their vulnerabilities precisely when it mattered most. The decision by his superiors to classify his actions speaks to another truth of warfare. Sometimes the most effective weapons are those the enemy doesn't know exist. By keeping Hawthorne's methods secret, British intelligence preserved a tactical advantage that would be employed throughout the war with increasing sophistication. In today's world of cyber warfare and electronic battlefields, Hawthorne's improvised electronic deception seems almost prescient, a forerunner of techniques that would become central to modern military operations. Yet the fundamental lesson transcends specific technologies or eras, that in the fog of war, initiative and moral courage sometimes matter more than rigid adherence to established protocols. Would you have broken the rules as Sergeant Hawthorne did, knowing that court-martial or worse might be the consequence? Would you have recognized when specialized knowledge created not just an opportunity, but a moral obligation to act beyond your orders? These are questions that continue to challenge military thinkers and ethicists today. Perhaps the final word on Roland Hawthorne's phantom frequencies should come from Lieutenant Morris's official report, partially declassified in 2005. The last paragraph reads, "In the analysis of the Dunkirk evacuation, much will be made of grand strategy, command decisions, and the miracle of rescue against overwhelming odds. Let it be recorded here, in this classified addendum, that miracles sometimes have human authors, and sometimes the most effective weapon in warfare is not a bomb or a bullet, but the mind of one individual with the courage to act when action seems impossible." Comment below and share this story so others remember what courage really means and how sometimes the most profound acts of heroism remain hidden for decades, known only to those whose lives were saved by frequencies that existed nowhere but in the mind of one extraordinary radio operator.